If you would, turn over in your Bibles to the book of Genesis chapter 32. Genesis chapter 32. And while you're turning there, I just have a simple question that I want to begin with as we start our lesson today. Have you ever had one of those days where it seems like somebody is after you? It seems like that everything that you put your hands on kind of falls to pieces, or everything that you try to do sort of goes wrong. Now we know that's really not the case, but there are days where it seems to be that way, right? Where nothing really goes your way. And what happens in days like that is all along those particular days, as those little things come out and they begin to jab us or they go wrong, we kind of bottle up the reaction. Because that's what we're supposed to do, right? We're supposed to, keep it in control and just kind of move past that. And then eventually, typically on days like that, unless you're just very different than me, there'll be that one thing some point later on in the day that just goes wrong and you've just had enough. And it's usually some stupid little insignificant thing, but we feel really safe at lashing out at it, whereas we didn't before. Some little thing will go wrong, and all of a sudden, man, it all just comes out. And we're yelling at the top of our lungs. Well, maybe you don't yell. Maybe for you, it's just kind of maybe you're just mumbling underneath your breath. Maybe it's that one word. I don't know, whatever it is. Whatever you do. But in some way, that frustration comes out. And finally, what has been bottled up inside of us all day has a voice. And we speak those words. For me, it was a trash can in the backyard just a couple of days ago. I had this genius idea. I went to my garage. We got a new garbage can. I don't know why I'm telling you about my garbage can in the sermon, but we have this new garbage can, right? And the old garbage can didn't like it. It was one of these stainless steel cylinders that goes straight down. Never buy one. Horrible. It creates suction, and you can't get your trash out, right? So anyhow, we got this tapered garbage can, and it's just too long. Every time you try to put one of those bags in, it falls down in. So you're digging down in the trash, trying to get your trash out. So I thought, well, you know what? What if I got a bungee cord? I got a bungee cord, put the bag in, and then put the bungee cord around the lip. Sure enough, it works. It works. You put the bungee cord around there, holds it in. Some people do with a big rubber band, whatever it is. But anyhow, it worked really, really well. The only problem was the other 23 hours that day didn't work so well. See, the other 23 hours in that day included trips to an emergency room. It included having to drive all over God's creation because I either forgot something, didn't do something, or was supposed to be somewhere and just didn't have time to get there. One thing after another just seemed to go wrong on this particular day, not to mention the fact that the previous 24 hours included only about 3 hours of sleep. So after all of those hours and after all of those built-up tensions, where all of these different things are coming at me, I'm in the backyard taking the garbage out. I pull the bag out, take the bungee cord off, and just let it fall to the ground. I grab the bag and I take the bag with me. Only what I don't realize is that when I release the bungee cord, it actually catches on the lip of the bag on the back side. So here I am, I'm walking with my trash bag like this out the back door with a bungee cord that I can't see hanging off the back of the bag. And you know what? It couldn't be that I just walk all the way to the garbage can with the garbage bag and the bungee cord and throw it in there and everything's done. No, that's not Ed's day. Ed's day is going to go like this. Garbage bag in hand, bungee cord on bag, walking outdoor, bungee cord catches on door. Bungee cord rips bottom of bag out, and so Ed has now got garbage all over the backyard. Well, there's one step in there I'm kind of leaving out. Ed got mad and started kicking the garbage. No, I'm just kidding. But, that's how it ends up. We come to that moment where finally we just kind of, let it out. And I'm back there and I'm yelling at the garbage. The garbage didn't do anything to me. It's garbage, right? Garbage doesn't do anything to you. But we have those moments like that. And when we think of moments like that in our life, I can't help but think of the idea of faith. And not just any kind of faith, but a faith that is tested. I mean, think about it. How bad was the day when they got up early and made the journey to that mountain that was afar off so that father could kill son. How good a day was that? How many questions were asked? Faith was being tested. You see, in order to get through this world, we're going to have a faith that is tough. A faith that has some skin on it, right? A faith that is going to be able to endure. And I think God at times gives us days like that. That's why I said, do you think someone's pursuing you? Because I think that God sometimes pursues us in our days and reminds us, hey, it's time to toughen up. It's time to see where your faith really is. So at times he brings us to these moments. These, what one writer has called the take off your gloves moments. You know, everybody knows what that means, right? And when you talk about taking off your gloves, you're talking about fighting. Getting in the real fight. If you turn in your Bibles, you don't have to turn there. I'll just read it to you. But in Psalm chapter 22, a psalm that is primarily written about Christ as a prophecy, it begins with this idea. My God, why have you forsaken me? Why are you so far from saving me, so far from my cries of anguish? Oh my God, I cry by day, but you do not answer, and by night, but I do not find rest. My God, why have you forsaken me? And in case we miss it, this is one of these off with the gloves moments. You ever notice how many times in the Bible we find things like this? I mean, sometimes we've got this kind of prim and proper notion of prayer that somehow, for some reason, has to be in King James English. I don't know. For some reason, prayer, in order to be legitimate, has to come with a thee and a thou. And yet when we go to the Bible, that's not always what we find, is it? We find God bringing people to these types of situations. Why have you forsaken me? Where are you? My enemies have compassed me about on all sides. I cry out day and night. Where are you? We find God bringing people to these places. Now, these words are about 3,000 years old. But I imagine they've been our words. If you've lived at all, if you've ever experienced frustration or anxiety or difficulty at all, then no doubt you share, if not the specific, the general sentiment behind these words. I'm struggling. I'm in anguish. And when that happens, we can do one of two things. We can be the bottle it all up inside and put on the happy face and go to God in prayer and pretend that there's nothing wrong. Or we can be honest with God. We can tell him how we feel. I mean, here's the kicker. He knows anyhow. I mean, you're not hiding it. He just wants to see if you're honest or not. Maybe you're sitting there thinking, God's forsaken me. Why would God do this to me? And then you go and pray, oh, thank you, God, for all of the blessings that you've given me each and every day. And somehow we don't see that God doesn't buy it. These words may be old words, but they speak to our struggle. They speak to what it means to be a child of God in this day and age. Now, I'm not going to tell you or even begin to make you believe that in the next 15 to 20 minutes, I'm going to give you some all-encompassing solution to help deal with those types of moments. And what that moment means for us. But I can tell you they are important moments. And in order to emphasize that idea, to kind of really bear it out here, maybe bring forth some steps in the process, I want us to go back to Genesis chapter 32. And I want us to look at the life of a guy by the name of Jacob. Now, Jacob is one of those kind of people here that on one hand we sort of hold him up as a hero of faith, and yet on the other hand we realize that Jacob isn't really a guy that has it all together. I mean, Jacob's got a lot of problems, especially in his youth. In his youth, you remember one of the earliest stories that we learn about Jacob is how he takes advantage of his brother, who comes in hungry from the field and, hey, I'll give you this bowl of soup if you sell me the birthright, right? I mean, who does something like that? If that person existed in our day and age, we would put him right up there with, and if any of you are used car salesmen, then, hey, no offense. But, that's where we put these people up there. You put them up there with the slimy salesman that's always trying to push the sale with the hard pressure, right? Well, that's this guy. He's taking advantage of a situation, and that's really one of the first things that we know about him. And you move on in this story, and it really doesn't seem to get too much better. Matter of fact, from the very word go, his name is Jacob, or Yaakov in Hebrew. Literally comes from a phrase that means at the heel of, or tripping at the heel. And let's face it, that kind of defines Jacob's life, doesn't it? Jacob is always the guy who seems to want to be in the position of tripping other people up. Always be in the position where he has a scheme, or he has some kind of manipulation that he's working against somebody else. That's Jacob. Not only does he do it with his brother, but in order to have that fulfilled, he ends up doing it with his father. Eventually, he pretty much runs out of people to deceive, at least it seems. So he moves on from his home, moves away from home. And then by the time we hit chapter 32, we're not going to go in a bunch in his life. You can read it if you want. By the time we hit chapter 32 of the book of Genesis, we realize that he's back, or at least he's heading back home. He's heading back home, and he's going to make amends with his brother, a guy by the name of Esau. Life up to this point has kind of been one that is defined by a series of these failures, so to speak. They've been these struggles. It's kind of like that day that you can have that all leads you to that one refining moment. And this is going to be the day for Jacob. He's on his way home. He gets word that his brother Esau is coming out to meet him. Anybody remember what he does? Anybody remember what Jacob does? If you go to verse 22, it says, "And that night Jacob got up, took his 2 wives, his 2 maidservants, and his 11 sons, and he crossed the ford of Jabbok. After he had sent them across the stream, he sent them over all his possessions." Now, it doesn't rightly say it in language we would understand, but here's what's going on. Hey, my brother Esau is coming to meet me, and he just might still be kind of upset with me and mad and maybe want to kill me, so why don't you go first? He sends the wife and the kids and all the possessions out there before him, and then he goes back. And when he goes back, something happens. He took them and sent them over the brook. Then Jacob was left alone, and a man wrestled with him until the breaking of day. As we continue reading, "Now when he saw that he did not prevail against him, he touched the socket of his hip, and the socket of Jacob's hip was put out of joint, and he wrestled with him. And he said, 'Let me go, for the day breaks.' But he said, 'I will not let you go unless you bless me.' So he said to Jacob, 'What is your name?' And he said, 'Jacob.' And he said, 'Your name shall no longer be called Jacob, but Israel. For you have struggled with God and with men and have prevailed.' Then Jacob asked, saying, 'Tell me your name, I pray.' And he said, 'Why is that you ask about my name?' And he blessed him there. And so Jacob called the name of the place Peniel. For I have seen God face to face, and my life is preserved. And just as he crossed over Peniel, the sun rose on him, and he limped on his hip. Therefore to this day the children of Israel do not eat the muscle of that shank, which is on the hip socket, because he touched the socket of Jacob's hip in the muscle that shrank." if you continue reading the story of Jacob, what you realize fairly quickly is that something about this event changes Jacob. From this moment on in his life, Jacob seems to be a more humble person. He seems to be a more vulnerable person. He's certainly a more generous person. In other words, something about this event changes the life of Jacob. And in order for us to understand why, we've kind of got to break it down into a few little pieces here. I've got 5 little things that I want to mention just very quickly that are part of this story, even though some of them are not really spelled out all that clear for us in the context. They certainly are in the larger context of the Bible as a whole. But go back to that point where it says, and it just kind of jumps out of nowhere, doesn't it? If you go back to chapter 32, back there in verse 24, then Jacob was left alone, and a man wrestled with him until the breaking of day. It's almost as if it's just the natural flow of things. As if, at any time, any one of us could be just standing there in the middle of the day, and some guy comes up and wrestles us. It's odd. I mean, it's just kind of an odd little story, isn't it? But it's a story that talks about the radical change of a man's life. It's one of those turning points, those transition types of moments. And it all begins because of what? I don't know, one of the things that always kind of hits me about this story is the fact that there's a fight going on, right? And if you've ever seen a fight, one of the first things that you always ask, after the fight, especially if, you're like a teacher or someone like, who started it, right? Tim, you ever said that? Who started the fight? Who started that fight? Who started this fight? You read the story, and it doesn't really spell it out for us, but it seems as if God comes and starts a fight with Jacob. I mean, why send the guy with him? Why send the guy down to Jacob, and why have him wrestle Jacob? Maybe Jacob was just in a wrestling kind of mood. God comes down and he picks a fight. He picks a fight, and I think this brings out an interesting point for us. Many times, transition, change in our life, our faith moving from weakness to strength, let's say, must include at times the idea of conflict. That there's a hurdle that we have to overcome. There's something that we have to get through. In some way, there's conflict. There's conflict. There's a battle. Well, you turn to the New Testament and you find that very language is going to be used by guys like Paul, who talk about, the sports, about runners who run or race. And then he would also talk about soldiers and about how they, wage their training and war. There's conflict. If you want to have a strength, if you want to have a faith that is tough enough to handle the things that this world is going to throw at it, then it's a faith that has to be in conflict. In other words, it has to be tested. So God comes down and he starts this fight with Jacob. He starts this fight with Jacob. And we know kind of how it goes for him. He wrestles with him for quite some time. And who knows how long it had to go on, but rest assured, any amount of time that it went on was time that this man was allowing Jacob to have before he put an end to it. It's kind of like the 16-year-old older brother wrestling with the 5-year-old little brother. Sometimes, the older kind of lets the younger win for a little while, give him a little confidence, and when really at any moment he could pretty much give him the smackdown. Rest assured, any amount of time that Jacob was wrestling was because this man, this angel, wanted it to go on. And we know that he touches him on the hip socket, and that one touch, according to the Bible, causes his hip to go out of joint. Now, the language here is really kind of odd. Really kind of odd. And if you dig into it a little bit, it's kind of hard to tell exactly what part of his body is being affected. We know that it's somewhere in this kind of girdle, the hip area. And it doesn't really matter for what we're doing with it. But, somehow he's given an injury that has caused him this great pain. He's given him this great pain. And it's the pain, seemingly, that kind of snaps Jacob out. Snaps him out of that past life. See, up to this point, Jacob's been the schemer. Up to this point, Jacob's been the deceiver. Up to this point, Jacob's been able, through the wit and his own earthly wisdom, to prevail over all of the adversaries that, came up against him. His brother, his father, Laban. All of these people who were part of his past life that he was able to manipulate and deceive. And here he is with this man, and it's not going to work this time. There's no deception here. God is deliberately sending this guy to come down and to change his life. And he's not going to be able to deceive his way out of it. And that's especially reinforced when his hip is put out of joint. Jacob's life has been filled with really many attempts to bargain with God and deception with him too. Oh, if you give me this, God, then I'll do this. If you give me this, God, then I'll do that. And you got to wonder at one point. You got to wonder at what point do we stop and look at the life of Jacob and realize that at times we're kind of like that too. And those days that we have where we come to these moments are sometimes really sort of self-serving types of things. But when we move that into kind of a spiritual circle, and we engage in this conflict, there's really only one acceptable thing that we can do, and I think it's the thing that Jacob does here when he's finally stricken with this pain. And that is that we have to confess that this life and our success, especially spiritually, is not dependent upon how I wage war in the conflict, or how well I run, but upon whether or not I am standing with God. Go back to the context and read just a little bit. He wrestles with the angel until the breaking of day. He touches his hip socket, puts it out of joint, and then in verse 26 he says, "Let me go, for the day breaks." But he said, "I will not let you go unless you bless me." This is the guy that's deceived and run his entire life. And now he's hanging on to something. He's gone through the conflict. He's now setting it all before God, showing his true face. That face that you kind of hide through that series of events that eventually comes out. He's laying it out like a confession. We turn to the New Testament, we find the idea all over the place. We're told that we're supposed to confess Christ, that is, say the same thing as Christ. We're told that we're to confess our faults one to another. In other words, have the faith and the courage enough to expose yourself to those of like precious faith. Become vulnerable enough because you have faith enough that no matter what happens, God is on your side. And he will get you through. In order for us to have a tough faith, we have to have the conflict. We have to have the confession. And then thirdly, we have to come out from behind that mask that sometimes we wear. That mask of the deceiver over here. I'm betting you this is one of the few times that Jacob was willing to show his true face to God. It's interesting. You remember near the end of that chapter? Near the end of that chapter where he talks about, and he named the place Peniel. And then he gives the reason why he names that place Peniel. For I have seen God face to face, and my life is preserved. And sometimes we think about it from the standpoint of, well, Jacob was there, but God was kind of veiled from him, and God showed his face to him. I think it's the other way around. I think Jacob was the one that was hiding. Jacob was the one that was hiding behind his deceptions, behind his schemes, behind all of the things that kept him running from his brother and running from his family and running from God. C.S. Lewis once wrote a book. The name of the book, and I'm not going to tell you what the book's all about, but you can read it for yourself, but the book title kind of says it all. It's called Till We Have Faces. Till We Have Faces. And the idea behind the book is the idea that we cannot see God until we are willing to show God our face. In other words, who we really are. You will not see the presence of God in your life. You will not feel the working of his providential hand. You will not see the answer to prayer until you expose your own face before him. You remember those passages, and there are a couple of them where it says, and we shall see him as he is, face to face. It's not his face that's hidden. It's ours at times. And we put on lots of different faces and we cover up when we really need to be taking it off. Jacob finally gets real with God. God starts the conflict. God elicits the confession. And Jacob gets real with God. And then two more things happen that I want to point out. Two more things happen. Jacob gets hurt. From that moment on in his life, his walk's never going to be the same. He's going to, from this day forward, walk with a limp. In other words, every day he's going to have to count certain things as lost in this world. Well, that's kind of reminiscent of something Paul said in the New Testament, isn't it? Paul said that he counted all things but lost. Counted all things but dung, so that he could gain the glory of God. So that he could even think for a moment that it was possible for him to be the kind of person that God would say, to which God would say, enter ye in to my glory. Paul traded everything, he said. The status, the education, his potential, his finances. And he gave it up to be pretty much a nomad who was bound for death. Now, sometimes I think we'd rather just have the limp. Because the spiritual struggle, the conflict, that confession, boy, that can take a lot. And sometimes that's very, very uncomfortable for us. But yet that's what God demands. He wants to see who you truly are. And he wants you to realize that there are things that aren't part of who you are. And those are the things that we need to rid ourselves of. Things that have the potential to draw us away from our devotion to him. I mean, what was Jacob working for when he deceived all these folks? Stuff, things, sheep, status, what? Oh, sure, the birthright was worth, twice the portion. It means him and his brother, right? He would get a double portion, which means his brother only got what? See how good we are in math. 1/3, right? Well, you'd only get 1/3. He got the bulk of it. And in the end, it would do what for him? And then the final thing I want you to notice here. The final part of this equation for having this tough faith that would transition or transform your life is that we have to count our blessings. We have to count our blessings. Jacob says, I will not let go until you bless me. He finally has found his commitment. I won't let go until you bless me. I'm not going to give up until I have a blessing from God. Man, is that our cry every day? God, I'm not going to give up on you. I'm going to hold firm. I'm going to stand committed to the faith because I know there is blessing. The passage that we use so much and yet steadily comes to mind as I think of those points is Revelation chapter 2. Verse 10, be thou faithful unto death, and I will what? Give you a crown. I'll give you a crown. There is blessing, but you see, it's not just blessing there. It's blessing here too. By having things such as that peace that passes all understanding. By having brothers and sisters to encourage and to look out for us and to help us. Jacob just didn't win. See, sometimes that's what we say. Jacob wrestled the angel and he overcame. I think Jacob wrestled the angel and the angel overcame him with the knowledge that his life needed to change. His faith needed to increase and strengthen. Maybe that's the position you're in this morning. Then again, maybe you haven't started that journey. You simply need to hear his word and believe and repent of your sins and confess the name of Christ that he is the Son of the living God. Enter into the waters of baptism, be washed clean so you can have that relationship with him. And so that you can grow and become the person that God intended you to be spiritually. Or maybe you just need to return. Have that courageous heart. Move your Christianity forward. Whatever your need might be, this morning make it known as together we stand and sing.